All right, guys, let's talk about it. The North American MVP was announced yesterday, and honestly, I was a bit surprised. I actually have a top 10 players video coming out soon-ish, but I didn't know who the MVP was, and I was talking about both Jack and Firstkiller, and I was just assuming apparently Jack won the MVP. Boy, was I wrong. Let's get into, was it a robbery by Firstkiller? Does he deserve it? Does he deserve it compared to last year, which is my main gripe with this? And to me, Firstkiller, a well-deserved MVP. I'm not too concerned about that in a vacuum, right? Against apparently Jack. But compared to last year, I have issues. Firstkiller, like if he's MVP this year, should have absolutely been MVP last year. It makes no sense to me, at least, that he didn't win it over Atomic, because apparently Jack had a much better year than Atomic did last year, in my opinion. And Firstkiller's year this year was, depending on how you look at it, at least equal, right? It could have been better in some ways, worse in others, right? So when you compare it, then apparently Jack should have absolutely won this MVP because Atomic won it last year. Now, I'm a Firstkiller stan the whole way, right? I think he's the best player in North America. I think he was absolutely deserving of the MVP last year. This year, however, I would have probably given it to apparently Jack, and that's mostly because of the major blemish. It was close, though. I was like back and forth. I was thinking, like, if apparently Jack goes to the spring major and doesn't really do much, then I would probably give it to Firstkiller then. But because apparently Jack, he still got a top 5 finish in spring, carried his team there as well, performed pretty well, I was going to give it to apparently Jack. So I was surprised, though, that Firstkiller won this based on what happened last year. Because last year, I was adamant Firstkiller should have absolutely won. And Atomic won. And I think a lot of that has to do with, like, because he joined a new roster and then that roster became number one. Like, I don't think that's necessarily only because of him. I think you have to compare, like, he has two very good teammates as well. And that's more of a comparison, him to Drees, if anything. So I don't think it necessarily worked there. But he did win an MVP at a major. But hey, apparently Jack did as well, right? So that's where the comparisons get a little weird. So I'm going to bring up a spreadsheet with all the stats from this past year and from the 21-22 season between Atomic and Firstkiller as well. So let's get into it. Hopefully this doesn't break. It did not break. We are good. Okay, so let's get into it. We'll compare and we'll go through the, like, basically, like, Atomic versus Abject, as well as them both versus Firstkiller in their years. So why don't we start with Firstkiller, because he's, like, the main topic here, because he had 2 seasons worth. Basically, this season in regionals was better than last year. There's really no other way to phrase that. Like, his stats are just better. He is number 1 in goals and assists. He was number 1 in goals and assists as well last year, but he just has more, which is great. Shooting percentage, like, sure, it's a good number occasionally to use when you're on a desk to just throw it out there. Like, oh, he shot 40%, but, like, okay, whatever. It's not a huge deal, but he is number 1 in shooting percentage. Goal participation is a big one, and he is number 1 in the league as well at 72%, basically. Fantastic year for Firstkiller. Even better than last year when you look at just regionals as a whole. Even the team goals per game plus minus, which is basically just average goals per game for the team versus average goals against per team, or per game, I should say. That's even higher. And that is number 1 across the board in both years. But again, 0.1 better this year for FaZe. There's one extra stat here, which we'll get to later, the overtime goals that Direct he started tracking this year, but I won't bring that up just yet. So, all in all, regional-wise, Firstkiller, if you just look at these numbers, had a better year, right? Even team points-wise, they were number 2. They were about 15% points down to the number 1 team, which is Gen G and then G2. So Atomic, he doesn't show all those points because he was on Envy for part of that season. So It was about the same year. Number 2 by a 15% point gap to number 1. But I think you have to talk about the elephant in the room, right? They missed a major. That is a big, big deal. And I think that's where Firstkiller's year gets downgraded compared to last year, in my opinion, at the very least. I get it. He did make it to, let's go over to the LAN tab here real quick. He did make it to a grand finals finally, but that does not make up for the gap of not even playing at a major, not even close. Like, last year, he had 2 3 4th place finishes, and then they had 1 bad major at 9 through 12. That is still much, much better than not attending a major. I'd much rather a 9th through 12th blemish than just not even making it to a major. That is a big deal. And that really just comes down to what people value, right? Like, obviously, MVPs are very, like everyone has a different opinion on what an MVP is. Last year, I thought it was absolutely Firstkiller in terms of just pure value. You could even argue that this year, pure value as well. But I think the value gets diminished a little bit because, or a lot, because they missed a major. And that also includes, like maybe this shouldn't be in consideration, but I think it should. Where they were up 3-0 against Optic, all they have to do is win 1 game, and they cannot get it done. Then they play a tiebreaker and also miss out there. Then you have to talk about Firstkiller in that grand finals with a huge mistake to cost them that series, or at least cost them game 6. At that point. And those are big-time moments where you expect an MVP to shine, right? Like, I don't think those moments are necessarily the big blemishes. It's more of just missing the major in general. And then, so that's a Firstkiller. I would say the years are comparable. I would say 22 season was a better Firstkiller than 23, just because he at least made it to every major. But it's close, right? Because his stats are better in 23. Now let's look at the comparison between Atomic and Appjack. So these guys are not going to be the ones getting a ton of score per game and all that on their squads, but clearly I think most people thought that Appjack was by far the best player on Gen G, was the leader of that team, and then Atomic was the best player on G2. Probably not the leader of that team but necessarily, but does that matter? Who knows? My argument, just with eye test, because obviously a lot of this is eye test, is that Appjack was better than his 2 teammates, probably more often, outside of Winter, I guess. So, like, Winter, he was a little shaky. But still, in general, I think he surpassed his teammates slightly more than Atomic. And I think there's an argument to go either way there. Because Atomic, he comes in, then G2's great, and everyone's just like, oh, it's all Atomic. But it really wasn't. Like, we saw JNabs and Chicago win of MVPs for regionals when they were popping off as well, right? So G2 as a whole, a very good team. Maybe I would say equal at worst, right? Between Appjack in terms of the best player on his team compared to Atomic as the best player on his team on G2, right? Now, Atomic's season, if you look across the board compared to Appjack, lower score per game, but about the same placement in terms of players. I think it was more of an offensive heavy year. Goals per game, though, you have to go to Appjack. And assists per game is slightly less than Atomic, but not by a lot, by 0.02. So Appjack, a better year. Yes, it was a more offensive year, but still a 3 and an 8 placement is much better than a 3 and an 18th placement in your region. Shooting percentage, again, I'm not too worried about this, not too much, but Appjack, he got 4th compared to Atomic's 21st. And then goal participation, which is a very big deal. 9th for Appjack compared to the 14th for Atomic, and it was 2.5% better, which that number won't change much anyway. Like a more offensive year, technically, you probably would have less goal participation because just by the nature of the odds, actually probably not. It would be the same percent. It doesn't really matter. Team points wise, Appjack obviously had a better year. He was on the number 1 team throughout the entire year. So that works. We got a Giblet site in here. All right, so team points wise, yes, Appjack clearly better than G2 or than Atomic, because Atomic was also on Envy. Maybe you can't fault him that much in fall. He joins a better team after that. He does very well there. Sure, I could see it maybe a little bit, but not enough. And then we go to teams goal per game plus minus. FaZe was first in both years, and then number 2 was both G2 and Gen G. So G2 was technically 0.40, and I didn't average it based on games played for Atomic. I got a little lazy with that stat, so it's probably actually a little bit lower, but about 0.40, 0.44 to 0.40, like in that area, right? So that's number 2 for both Atomic and Appjack on their squads. Again, Appjack, his goals per game plus minus was much, much higher. And then this last stat that we don't have tracked, obviously, for the previous year, but overtime goals. And I just wanted to shout out Appjack. I know the stat, like, you have to play a lot of overtimes for this to happen. I don't know the percentage of his goals, yada, yada, and all that stuff. But still, very impressive. 18 goals. I think the next highest was, like, 12 throughout, like, all regionals for all players. So, Appjack, clutch goals when it matters. Firstkiller, he had half of those at 9. He was still 10th place, still good, but that's just a little extra icing on the cake for apparently Jack. Moving over to lands. So again, we're trying to compare them. Right now, it's just Atomic and Appjack, right? So Atomic last year, they're pretty much the same. It's pretty close right here. That's a 1.39 or 1.4, and then Appjack had a 1.3. So like Atomic slightly better there, and slightly better goal participation, and slightly better goals per game. So all in all, you would say it's like Atomic was better on LAN in terms of stats. The one issue with that is the team placements. He finished 13th, first, and 10.5. I just average between like all the places that they finish at. While it's apparently Jack made top 8 every single time, which is a huge accomplishment. Obviously going to have tougher opponents at that point. 1, 6.5, and 5.5. And he even had 4 overtime goals. Clutch moment by apparently Jack. One fun fact, Zen in just the spring major had 5 overtime goals. Absolutely insane. But like from this, I would still say apparently Jack would probably be slightly better in terms of lands than Atomic. They both won an MVP. They both won one. But then Atomic didn't even make top 8 in his last 2. While apparently Jack made top 8 in both. I get it. He was number 5 seed through spring regionals, but they showed up when it mattered most and finished with a top 5 finish. So apparently Jack, I think, wins that over Atomic. Then you look at Firstkiller's lands, and we're going to talk about this again. Firstkiller was what, 1.3? And then what is this one? I'm not doing... Actually, about exactly the same. It's very, very close. Shooting percentage-wise, about the same. That stat doesn't really matter. Goal participation-wise, Firstkiller was much higher, though, in the lands for this year. So you got to give him a little bit of credit there. Goals per game, though, was down for his team. They were not doing as well. But again, that could be tougher competition because they only had 2 lands. So 0.02 versus 0.20. Pretty comparable stats. But again, he didn't play in a whole LAN. He didn't play in one of the majors for this year. That's a demerit. There's no other way to talk about that. You would much rather at least get a 10.5 placement 9th through 12th than you just not even playing at the major. So 22 Firstkiller, much better LAN numbers, or much better like on LAN. I get it. He made a grand final. He finally won one extra match. Whoop-de-doo. But he didn't play at one of these majors. So, all in all, when we look at it, Firstkiller regionally was much better in 23. Or slightly better, I should say, than 22 Firstkiller. But still number 1, right? He was the number 1 player regionally for both of these. So that's not really a huge issue. But apparently Jack versus Atomic regionally, I would say Appjack was better as well. Then you look at lands. We have Firstkiller 23 was much worse than Firstkiller 22 just because they didn't play at a LAN. And then apparently Jack was still better than Atomic at lands. So how do you have apparently Jack, who is better in both cases than Atomic, regionally plus lands, Firstkiller was very comparable between both. At worst, I would say he had a worse year because of not making a LAN. Slightly better numbers regionally, but worse at LAN, so we'll equal that out and say it's about the same year. How does Atomic win MVP in 22 and Firstkiller win in 23? The only way I see it is they're righting some wrongs, right? Or maybe there's a new way that they want to consider the MVP, which is possible. But, like, 23 Firstkiller, a very valuable component. I still think Appjack, in terms of what I consider what an MVP is, I would have gave it to him. But it was very, very close. It was 1A, 1B. So I'm not too concerned about Firstkiller winning it through this year. My main concern is if he won it this year, there is absolutely no reason Firstkiller should not have won it last year. And this is not to hate on Atomic. Atomic had a fantastic year. But still, Firstkiller had a godly year. He had back-to-back godly years, except he missed a LAN this time. That's really it. That's really what it comes down to. Who do you think should have won the North America MVP? Once again, based on the criteria that I would set, I would have had Firstkiller win in 22, and then Appjack win in 23. So what do you think? Who should have won in 22? Who should have won in 23? Let me know in the comments below. That's going to do it for this video. It's a little bit of a bonus video. I normally don't put one out on, what's today, Tuesday? But I wanted to get this out because I put a lot of work into these numbers and all that stuff too. Like, I had to track down a few of them. But I just question why 22 is different than 23. To me, it's confusing. I don't know if it's confusing to you. I just wanted to rant about this a little bit. I hope you guys enjoy these rants. I'm trying to keep them shorter. This one went a little bit longer than I wanted. But hey, what are you going to do? So that'll do it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. We got a lot more videos coming throughout the World Championship. I already have pre-recorded 3 extra videos, and then we'll do a recap / predictions for the World Championship main event when I'm in my hotel room in Germany. So we'll see if that actually uploads, but we'll try our best. But thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.